I would now like to invite Honorable Andrew Naput, former Minister of Internal Affairs and Deputy Speaker of Vanuatu Parliament, for a special address. And please utilize the simultaneous interpretation receivers. It's channel 3 if you need Korean interpretation.
Dear friends, greetings from the beautiful islands of Vanuatu in the South Pacific Ocean. Please allow me to thank the organizers of this event, and especially the Honorable Chai Chung-lee, Member of Parliament of South Korea, and her team for organizing such an important event. I also would like to thank the keynote speakers who are going to participate in this important event. Let me begin by placing on record that the discussions in this event are not about expression of political views. They are not about defending geopolitical interests. This is rather about discussing a very, very important issue that concerns the livelihood and survival of our people who are living in the Pacific Islands and the Pacific Ocean. Let me give you a bit of background. In the year 1995, 13 Pacific Island nations decided to come together to sign a treaty called the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone Treaty. This treaty was later ratified by our respective parliaments. In Vanuatu, our parliament ratified the treaty in 1996. The leaders in the Pacific came to witness the devastating impacts of nuclear activities around the world. And so they decided to come up with such a treaty to send a message to the nations around the world that Pacific must continue to remain nuclear free. We became aware of Japan's intention to dump the radioactive water into the ocean last year, and members of parliament from across the Pacific have come out to voice their concern to Japan to reconsider their intention to dump this radioactive water into the ocean. The reason why our Pacific Island nations decided to come up with such a position is because we come from relatively small island nations and small island states, and our people depend on what our small islands produce and also the ocean. So any activity that contaminates the ocean or the land is going to be the end of our survival. In Fiji last year, our leaders similarly agreed to send a message to Japan that they must reconsider the dumping of the radioactive water into the ocean. Based on several scientific information that we got from the scientists and experts, we have come to realize that the water that Japan is intending to dump into the ocean is not safe. Therefore, if Japan is intending to dump the water into the ocean, it must consult the Pacific Island nations. It must consult the leaders of the Pacific Island nations. The reason why we have continued to state our objection to this activity that is going to be done by Japan is because we believe that the water is not safe, the radioactive water is not safe. Based on a film by Philip Carrillo called The Fukushima Disaster, The Hidden Side of the Story, it has become very clear that the water is not safe. And based on scientific information from experts and scientists, they have stated very clearly that the water is not safe. Therefore, based on that, we are calling on Japan to stop the dumping of the radioactive water into our oceans and to consult and allow independent experts to go and conduct their own assessments and come up with conclusions to inform us that the water is safe before we can make further decisions. And I believe that the discussions in this event is going to shed more light on this topic, and I thank you all for taking the time to participate and for expressing the views of our people on what is ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Thank you very much. That was Honorable Andrew Napoet. He initially intended to join us online. However, due to other commitments, he was not able to do so, and instead he sent us his video.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to present today. My name is Bob Richmond. I'm a research professor and director of the Kuala Lumpur Laboratory at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm also a member of the expert panel that's engaged by the Pacific Island Forum to advise the Pacific Island leaders on the safety and concerns that have been raised about this. There are 5 scientists with complementary skills. We were engaged in December of 2021, and for the last 18 months have been involved in review of existing documents. We've been in meetings with the Japanese, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, EPCO, as well as with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And several of us, myself included, traveled to Fukushima in February of last year to have a look at the site and to meet with the Japanese as well. My training is as a biologist. I also have worked in the area of radiation biology and biophysics on the uptake and accumulation of radionuclides by organisms. And I actually performed my doctoral dissertation at Enewetak Atoll in the Marshall Islands, where I spent 2 years at one of the testing sites for the nuclear testing program from the United States that during the 1950s. My concerns are along the biological side. And in this slide, it's just the route in which we're concerned that radionuclides can get into marine organisms, they can get into people. On the left side of the slide, there are 2 radionuclides that I mention here, tritium, which is a radioactive form of hydrogen, and carbon-14, which again is a radioactive version of a carbon. And the reason why we're interested in these is because all life is carbon-based. Carbon and hydrogen are the foundations of everything from our structures, our bodies, as well as our energy systems. Tritium has a half-life of about 12.3 years, carbon-14, 5,730 years. So they're pretty wide in terms of their ionizing radiation exposure and the time. On the upper left-hand panel, the beautiful green things there are phytoplankton under a microscope. These are the foundation of all oceanic food webs. And this is where a lot of the initial uptake and trophic transfer and accumulation can begin, because phytoplankton are photosynthetic like any other plant. They use solar energy to be able to make carbohydrates and sugars from carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. And these phytoplankton then are eaten by zooplankton, the small animals that live in water. And these work their way up through the food web to larval fish, to adult fish, and eventually to people. And so this is one of my overriding concerns as a marine biologist, is to look at how radionuclides interact with the ocean. We've been in some animated discussions, I'll say it politely, with a number of ocean chemists who have correctly talked about dilution and chemical interactions. But if the ocean were a sterile glass aquarium, devoid of life, it's quite different than what we're dealing with in reality. And that is the way in which radionuclides interact with organisms, by which they can take up radionuclides, they can transfer them from one trophic level, one food level to the next, and they can bioaccumulate. Tritium has been well known to be organically bound. And so once again, we're very concerned about statements that are made saying that there are drinking water standards, it's okay to drink tritium. There's a big difference between drinking tritiated water and having water that affected organisms and worked its way up through the food chain. One example recently, a study showed that the half-life of organically bound tritium in a liver of a bottom-feeding fish was over 550 days. That's quite different than what's often discussed as a few days for it to pass through. And there's a big difference in the way in which organisms, including people, process this kind of material. As a marine biologist, this is where a lot of my action is. I've been working in the Pacific Islands for 43 years. And it's very clear the connection between environmental health and human health. The two are inextricably linked. Anything that compromises the healthy environment, by definition, will impact human health. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. For the Pacific Islands and all Pacific Island nations, this addresses things like food security. For the Pacific Islands in particular, this also affects things like cultural identity and practices. The two slides on the right, the upper one is some of my fishing buddies from Eniwetok Atoll, showing communal fishing. In the lower panel there, we see women who are doing communal fishing, but this is far more than capturing protein. I do a lot of work with communities in the Pacific Islands and with groups, including the women's groups, particularly of Palau. One group of women explained to me that they consider their coral reefs and their coastal areas as the community psychiatrist, meaning this is where many of the social interactions occur that provide the very fabric of society. This is where older women mentor younger women. This is where children learn to interact. This is where problems are solved, everything from domestic disputes to governmental issues. And so for them, they indicate that even if they don't catch fish, the time they spend on these areas in these communal activities are essential to their cultural identity, to their fabric, their cultural fabric. And so while I'm a scientist and a biologist working at the interaction of radionuclides and organisms, I can't be blind to the fact that these activities that interfere with environmental health and the sustainability of ocean resources have drastic effects on the communities that depend on these resources for their very existence. This includes individual and community health, everything from diet to physical health, and as well as mental health. And it's very disturbing to see that in areas where coastal resources, including coral reefs, where I do a lot of my work, have been compromised, they now have a dialysis center in Palau. Pacific Islanders have among the highest levels of coronary heart disease and diabetes in the world, non-communicable diseases, and this is tied to the health of the ocean. We know that the ocean is under multiple stressors at the moment, and this is one additional stress for which we're very concerned. This is a time when we're looking at ways in which we can improve ocean health, and clearly the way the plans are going forward is working counter to that goal. Economic stability of the islands and Pacific nations is tied to the vitality of the ocean resources, and also the ecological integrity, the way in which ecosystems interact, the way the parts of the ecosystems interact, and the way in which people interact with their ecosystems, again, are foundational. And so these concerns start at the very base of the food web and work their way right up to the top, including the top consumers, which are generally people. As was mentioned in a previous discussion, that this discharge is to occur over at least 30 years. As we look carefully at the plans as they're going forward, it may actually be longer than that. And that truly is intergenerational, meaning my generation, my daughter's generation, and any generation of grandchildren that may come along. And so the question is, how can we examine this issue within the full context of what this really means? Not only is this transgenerational, but it's also transboundary. These are things that will not simply stay within the Japanese coast. And we know even the year in which the Fukushima disaster occurred in 2011, within that year, tuna were caught off the west coast of California, off of San Diego, carrying cesium from Fukushima. They were fingerprinted. The levels were low. We understand that. But the issue is that these are transboundary issues, that not only will ocean currents take radionuclides, but likewise organisms that move across the ocean, including fish. And recently it's been shown that even plastics, which are a big issue in the oceans, can carry radionuclides. Plastics, because they're petroleum products, actually often have a background signal of radionuclides, but PET plastic in particular has been found to be able to carry radionuclides and distribute across the ocean. And this gets back to the idea of environmental sustainability. So when we look holistically at not individual elements of the concerns, but the way that these could impact people, the health of the ocean, and the health of the people who depend on the ocean, there are numerous concerns that have not been adequately addressed. And as the previous speaker spoke, I'm a big fan of the precautionary principle. And what we often deal with in my line of work, I deal with everything from pesticides and heavy metals to radionuclides and to plastics. And an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, meaning If you don't have data to show something is wrong, it doesn't default to it being right. It simply means you lack data. And this continues to be a concern for those of us on this panel, is the data gaps that continue to exist, the information that is inconsistent, the information that is non-reproducible, and the lack of critical information upon which to make sound policy decisions. For a scientist who is dealing with the intersection between science and policy on a regular basis, this is not a surprise to anybody in this room. Policy does not advance with science. Science is advancing weekly, monthly. We have new discoveries. Policy, you're very lucky if it's on the time of a couple of years to decades. And so many of the rules, regulations, and agreements that are in place today are no longer valid based on the most recent data. And we have new molecular tools. One of the ways in which we now study radionuclides and how they affect things, there are two major categories of effects. One are called the stochastic effects. Those are cancers. And as the name implies, those are by chance and they're very hard to pin down. And so this is one of the issues with things like the release of radionuclides into the ocean, is you don't see these effects for years to decades, but that doesn't mean these effects don't occur. The other kind of effect, other than stochastic, the ones that happen by chance, are the ones we call deterministic. Those are more defined, and those now we have techniques to understand things we never did before, including how radiation can affect DNA, the very information in our cells that tells us what to do. It causes DNA damage. We have two kinds of DNA in our bodies. Every organism, upper organism, has two kinds of cells, two kinds of DNA. We have nuclear DNA, which is the information that passes on your genetic information from one generation to the next. Things like eye color, skin color, baldness is genetically linked. The other part of the cell is the mitochondria. This is the power plant of the cell. And there is also mitochondrial DNA that's really important for things like metabolism. Nuclear DNA has a little bit of a protection in a nuclear membrane. Mitochondrial DNA has no such protection whatsoever. And this gets back to even the issue, often it's been said, well, tritium and these others are low-level beta emitters. Beta emitters are not as much of a concern for external exposure. I've heard people say, well, don't worry about it. You'll get more beta emissions in an airplane flight from Seoul, Korea to Los Angeles, California. But once again, that's missing the point. An external exposure to beta emitters is quite different than internal exposure. Most beta emitters are stopped by skin, certainly by clothing or by paper. But once you ingest a beta emitter, it's quite different. Your cells do not have that protection. And that's why the difference between a nuclear DNA versus mitochondrial DNA comes into effect. These DNA strands, RNA strands, and signaling proteins, and I'm kind of getting a little bit nerdy on you as a scientist, but the very things that enable us to function, to live, to survive, are all based on these very subtle chemical signalings that go on within the cell. And we have new techniques now to be able to resolve the kinds of concerns better than ever before. This idea of organically bound tritium is still an area of open research and very interesting research, but there's still a lot to be learned there. And so statements to say we are going to adhere by all accepted standards is a very different answer than we will guarantee the health of our oceans and the people who depend on the oceans. Meeting a standard does not necessarily mean that that will be healthy, and we can all think of examples where standards were established only to be revised down later as new data became available. So all of these isotopes, I've mentioned tritium and carbon-14, but these actually may not be the ones of greatest concern. Strontium is a very big concern. Strontium is called the bone hunter. It basically will adhere to bones. It will be incorporated into bones. Our bones are the site of where red blood cells are being produced, blood cells all the time. And so we have cellular division going on within the marrow of our bones on a regular basis. Strontium can then get bound into bone, and then it can bathe cells that are dividing, and that's where we start to see big concerns coming forward. So again, it's a little bit more of the heavy-duty science, but it's just to point out that as we look at stochastic concerns of cancer, that's a really hard one to deal with, because the epidemiology of cancer, there are so many reasons why cancer can be initiated. And so it's hard to separate out when you can really show. but there are statistics to be able to show what the chances are. And just again, hook it back to what people are being affected by. Turns out that the recent data shows that Pacific Islanders have among the highest levels of cancer in the world. And one thing is for certain, the release of radionuclides into the ocean certainly is not going to reduce cancer opportunities and stochastic chances within these populations. To then move on to my final slide is to say that, this is a tragedy. All of us who are involved in this, studying it, working with colleagues both in Japan and throughout the Pacific, realize that this was a tragedy. If you look at a number of very well-designed scientific studies, they showed that this was actually totally preventable. And this is a concern going forward. I can send references to anybody who wants, but there are two very good papers, one done by the Carnegie Institute, another good scientific study, showed the number of errors that were made that led to this. In the planning, in the execution, this never should have happened. We can't go back. We're stuck with where we are today. So if we're looking at where we are today, can we do better moving forward? As a marine biologist, I know that this is the United States ocean decade. We should be doing everything possible to remove the stressors of the ocean in a world of climate change, elevated seawater temperatures, ocean acidification, microplastics, regional pollution, and overfishing. Is death by 1,000 cuts. And anything that continues to add to this, we're not dealing with a blank canvas. It's not just radionuclides and discharges from Fukushima that matter. It's the overall health and the integrity of the ocean that is already compromised. And the question is, should we continue with business as usual, or is this an opportunity to change the trajectory going forward? This is clearly not the first, nor will it be the last such catastrophe. Unfortunate, but true. But isn't this an opportunity then to move from tragedy to opportunity? Japan could become the world's leader in advancing new approaches to a very serious international problem that's likely to increase over time. And this is what we've been promoting as well. Due to the transboundary and transgenerational nature of the problem, new approaches and alternatives to ocean dumping are clearly needed and are the only responsible way forward. And as part of our panel, it's one thing to say, no, don't do that. But we also are very careful to look at what options are scientifically supported going forward. And we're now presenting a technical memo to the Pacific Island Forum leaders showing that the use of the water to make concrete for use on the Fukushima site would use up the stored water within a much shorter period of time. Estimates are somewhere around 5 years. Concrete takes a lot of water. And once the concrete, the water is bound up in the concrete, if their advanced liquid processing system, their ALP system, is operating as they say it will to remove the higher concerning radionuclides, then in fact there should be no issue whatsoever, because the beta emissions can't penetrate more than 5 microns or something of that nature, 5/100ths of a micron. So we've done calculations. The concrete alternative is much better. I've been to the Fukushima site, and they definitely need to pour a lot of concrete. Everything from their seawall to their underground ice barrier to keep groundwater out of the 3 reactors that are in meltdown. Also to stabilize the large quantities of radioactively contaminated soil that are in the site. And there are a couple of things, and there are lawyers here, not me, but looking at the International Atomic Energy Agency General Safety Guidance 8 talks about transboundary. If it's kept on site, that transboundary issue goes away immediately. There's another guidance that's internationally accepted called ALARA, A-L-A-R-A, as low as reasonably achievable. And that says that no one or no thing should be exposed to radiation, if at all possible. And once again, keeping it on site in concrete is a viable option going forward. So I'll simply end by saying that as a scientist, I remain concerned, along with my colleagues. We're reviewing their radiological environmental impact assessment. We see deficiencies there. We were on a 3-hour call with Japan 2 days ago. We're grateful that the conversations and communications are still open. We have a call with the International Atomic Energy next week, and we're hoping that through an honest dialogue that we would be able to insert science into this issue to be able to provide the guidance going forward. And I'll simply say, as a scientist, I would like to express my sincere respect and appreciation to the leaders from Korea, to the leaders from the Pacific Island Forum for doing their due diligence, because this is an issue, a very concerning issue now and for generations to come. It's also an opportunity to do it right at a time where we really need to be looking at the health of our oceans holistically and all of the people who depend on our oceans going forward. I would love to see the science in a major role in driving this bus, but I have to say our observations at this point are that the politics and economics are overriding much of the science. We'll continue to do our best, and I'm committed to doing the best I can as a scientist. I'm data driven. And when data are provided that show me that these issues are not a concern, I'll certainly accept them. We are certainly not at that point at this time. So thank you for your time, and I'm available as people would like to go into more detail as necessary. Thank you very much.
예, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much. Next, we would like to move on to the discussion session. We have experts from both Korea and overseas, so I think that we will be able to have some in-depth discussions. I would like to kindly ask our discussants to keep their presentation to 5 minutes. First of all, I'd like to invite over Fairwind's Chief Engineer, Ernie Gunderson.
Hello, and thank you. Thank you also to the translators who are working very hard to do this simultaneous translation. And thank you to the Koreans and the Pacific Islanders who have taken this very important issue as seriously as it should be taken. Let me get right into my speech, and I'll be followed in 5 minutes by Maggie. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen, but it behaves identical to hydrogen. The Fukushima plant, it will not be releasing tritium directly. The tritium will be bound into water, and that's called tritiated water. Here's an example. You think of water as a hydrogen, an oxygen, and another hydrogen. That's 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. That's H2O. But one of the hydrogens in tritiated water is 3 times as heavy. And that's an H and an oxygen and a tritium atom. So the Fukushima plant will be releasing tritiated water. Once that water leaves the plant, though, the Japanese government would like you to believe it stays as tritiated water. When you imbibe tritium, tritium external to your body has no effect. When you imbibe tritium, though, when it's inside your body, it emits a radioactive particle called a beta particle that travels longer than the length of a DNA molecule. So if that tritiated water molecule is next to a DNA molecule, it will damage the DNA molecule. But the other part is what Bob was just saying is sometimes that tritium leaves the water molecule and gets attached to a carbon molecule. And in that case, it's called organically bound carbon. And the amount of time it stays in your body is dramatically different. Tritiated water stays in your body on the order of less than 50 days, but organically bound tritium stays in your body for several years. That allows that tritium that's emitting a radioactive bullet to damage the surrounding cells. So by the IAEA and the Japanese government, focusing on HOT, I like to say it's hot, hydrogen, oxygen, and tritium, they changed the argument so it doesn't address the organically bound material. The other thing is that the tanks contain more than tritium. It's quite clear that they contain strontium and cesium as well. And a lot of that material, radioactive material, has settled to the bottom of the tank. So when they're measuring in the middle or at the top of the tank, they're not determining what's in that tank. As the tank is drained, however, the particles on the bottom of the tank will also be dispersed. And I fear that the releases will not only be tritiated water, but will also be cesium and strontium and other particulate matter. I have and I'm sure Bob has research projects he would love to do as well. But lacking funding, it's very difficult to show that the damage caused by tritium. A lot of us understand that, and the industry's position is that the radiation is weak and it doesn't penetrate your skin, which is true. But if you've imbibed it or inhaled it, now it's right up against the inner membranes of cells, and that's what causes damage. I'm going to pass it over to Maggie now. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다. 이어서 매기 건더슨.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I would like to kindly ask Maggie Gunderson to continue on with their comments.
I'm here. Sorry. I've been having computer issues tonight. I apologize. Thank you all for hosting us very much. I founded Fairwinds in 2008, and one of the things that we've told all of you a lot about Fukushima in the different years. 12 years ago, the fuel melted down. It's cool now. The fact that the Japanese keep saying that they have to keep dumping all this cooling water, it's not true. Why is there still water there? TEPCO does not want to admit how Fukushima was built. And a whole mountain was cut away so they could put the plant nearer to the water, and it was cheaper to build it that way. If they had not done that, they maybe would not have had this tsunami issue that they had, plus they neglected to put up the tsunami wall. We wrote a best-selling book called Fukushima, The Truth and the Way Forward. It was a bestseller in Japan, and it was published in 2012 and was a seminal piece of work about Japan. One of the things that was really important to what we did is that even though Japan and its people are hurting, the government, especially under Prime Minister Abe, decided to keep the plants open and continue what they've done. They have forced radioactive water to come down the mountain. The water comes into the plant and runs through it and gets more and more radioactive. That's all the groundwater in that area. They have many other alternatives to running that water. For one thing, the alternatives, if you have a bathtub running and it's overflowing, you're going to turn it off. They can stop this water. We had suggested, and Dr. Richmond just talked about some of the ideas that they could do to lessen the water. We have suggested using zeolite. It's a mineral. It's not even having to make concrete. It's a mineral that absorbs and water, and it makes it into brick type things. We suggested that from the very beginning, before Japan built the ice wall or anything else. And it clearly, you can look at the site on Google Earth, and you can see that there's plenty of land in proximity. They do not have to use all these tanks. They can use zeolite to absorb the water, and it can turn into a kind of brick that they can then leave on site and store in a different manner. Additionally, if you look at Google Earth, you'll see all this open land. They're saying that they don't have any land, and that's why they need to release these tanks, and that's just not true. They can use adverse possession. Dr. Troy talked about some of the legalities, and they can take that land because it's already so contaminated. No one can build on it, use it, or live on it, or anything for thousands and thousands of years. It is adjacent to the total meltdown and catastrophe. So they can put tanks there. They don't have to release this water. And I hope that all of you will be able to work together on the legal issues because they're severe. I'm a paralegal. That's part of what I do that works with attorneys as an aide and a senior person. And I work with nuclear attorneys who are on the plaintiff's side every day. That's a large part of my work and why I founded Fairwinds. And I think that what's happening now can be handled by TEPCO, but they don't want to. They didn't want to handle it in the beginning. When we wrote our book, and it was fact-checked by Shueisha, who published it, TEPCO did not admit to all the things we proved and said, and we were criticized by the nuclear industry for saying these things, just like Dr. Richmond alluded to some of the criticism he's received, and we had tremendous criticism. But everything that we brought forward, right starting the day the catastrophe and the meltdown started, everything was proven within 5 years. And the final pieces, somebody internally sent us a PowerPoint that was shown inside TEPCO, and it said exactly what we'd been saying for 5 years. So I think confronting them in legal issues is one of the most important things you can do. And I agree with Dr. Richmond and Dr. Choi that these are the most precious resources that you have. As Arnie said, and we were both whistleblowers from the nuclear industry, and it's just very clear to us that the governments want to maximize their chance to keep nuclear power going in hope of someday having nuclear weapons to use. And it's going to condemn our entire world if this tritium, and I've learned from Dr. Ian Farley much of this work, and he's a world-renowned expert in tritium in UK, and he agrees with what Dr. Richmond was saying 100%. And he's proven that in data from all the nuclear plants around Europe and how they are leaking and they are contaminating and where kids are getting sick. We don't want that. We don't want that in our oceans. We don't want anything to happen to our children and our families. So please keep pushing on, and we're behind you, and we're here to help you however we can. Thank you for this opportunity.
예,